1 miles through the Isthmus of Suez in northeastern Egypt. It was originally dug out of the desert by hand. Today, the canal is wide enough to accommodate vessels 500 meters long, 70 meters wide, and 70 meters deep. There are no locks because the two seas are the same level. Ships of all shapes, sizes, and flags pass through the canal each year. Everything from a supertanker or aircraft carrier to the smallest pleasure craft. Since the day it was completed in 1869, the Suez Canal has been a vital link in world trade, providing a shortcut between Europe and Asia, eliminating the long journey around Africa. On the day it opened, the world became smaller. For centuries, Egypt has served as gatekeeper between two worlds, East and West.
Egypt has always been a center for trade coming from the Far East, which would come to Egypt and then would be divided into the 5 trade routes going south to the Sudan, west to North Africa, north to Europe, the Ottoman Empire. And it's a distribution center, if you like.
The most direct route from Europe to the Near and Far East was by ship through the Mediterranean, then overland through the Isthmus of Suez in northeastern Egypt. Passage through the desert was long and difficult. Once a caravan arrived at the Red Sea, goods and passengers were loaded back onto ships for the rest of the journey. Since ancient times, mankind sought to construct a water passage through Egypt.
We know that some kind of a canal did exist in what is today the Suez Canal region as far back as the 19th century BC, during the time of the ancient Egyptians.
In these ancient times, the Red Sea extended north to what today are known as the Bitter Lakes and Lake Timsah. The pharaoh Sesostris I ordered the construction of a canal to connect these Suez lakes with the Nile River. Sesostris and the pharaohs after him managed to create a waterway between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, just wide enough to accommodate the boats of that era.
Egypt had possessions all the way down south in Africa. Egypt, the Egyptian kingdom, the ancient Egyptian kingdom. And in a sense, if that canal existed, it existed mainly for the purposes of Egyptian trade as opposed to international trade.
The Canal of the Pharaohs became a well-traveled route and lasted 1,200 years until 664 BC. By then, desert winds had piled sand between the Bitter Lakes and the Red Sea, cutting off the route. In 609 BC, the pharaoh Necho tried to excavate a new channel, but more than 100,000 workers were said to have died in the attempt, most likely from starvation and exposure to the blistering desert heat. A century later, Darius, king of Persia, began working to uncover the lower portion of the canal. The job was completed 2 centuries later, when Ptolemy II completed a canal that ran all the way from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea.
In a sense, the extension from the Red Sea to the site of what is today Port Said is the Ptolemaic Canal. That canal itself corresponds, if you will, to the current Suez Canal.
During the Roman occupation of Egypt from 30 BC to 14 AD, the Canal of the Pharaohs was maintained and improved. During this period, trade flourished in the region. Greek, Egyptian, and other merchants passed daily over the desert, both by ship on the canal and overland in great caravans. They carried the wealth of the East to trade for Roman gold. In the 7th century, at the time of the Muslim domination of Egypt, it was rebuilt by order of the Caliph Omar. The canal remained in use for another century, but then the desert reclaimed it. This time, it stayed buried for 1,000 years. Trade now moved exclusively overland, via caravan. But there were obstacles. Arab desert raiders were taking a toll, and even if these could be avoided, the pirates of the Red Sea were a constant threat. Then in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing for the first time around the Cape of Good Hope. The route took longer than going overland, but it was considered a great deal safer.
Even with that particular change, a lot of trade continues to go through land. And in a sense, there was always this dream of being able to finally connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and thus in the process reduce the length of the trip.
By the end of the 15th century, the Egyptian link in the chain of trade was broken. Trade with the East was dominated for the next 4 centuries by the British, Dutch, and Portuguese merchant ships, who sailed around the southern tip of Africa, a journey that took 4 months. In 1850, Europe was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, undergoing enormous social and economic change. The old aristocracy was losing its hold, and wealth was pouring into the hands of the new middle class. Trade with the Far East was no longer a luxury. Now it was essential for Europe's economic growth. The factories of England and the continent needed copra, jute, ore, and cotton. In 1845, the first railway line in Egypt was completed. It connected the Mediterranean port of Alexandria with the Red Sea port of Suez. This service was a boon to passengers, but it did little to silence the demand for cargo space.
It's a limit how much a railway line can carry in terms of passengers and shipping, whereas through a canal you can have any number of ships going through.
At this same time, a maritime revolution was taking place. Steamships with screw propellers and iron hulls were replacing the old wooden sailing ships. Now there were ships capable of carrying enormous loads of goods from the east. But the trip around the Cape still took far too long. The eyes of the world once again fell on the Isthmus of Suez. In 1798, Napoleon and his troops had invaded and occupied Egypt. At that time, the chief French engineer of the expedition, a man named Lepere, surveyed the Isthmus of Suez to determine the feasibility of a canal. The engineer concluded that there was a 30-foot difference in water level between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Building a canal between them, he reported, would be impossible. That
Particular fear was completely alleviated by additional surveys that were made in the late 1840s. In a sense, even though the surveys proved that what you're dealing with is the same water level, it was not until the actual opening of the canal in 1869, almost 20 years later, that everybody's fears were now proven to be wrong.
1,000 years had passed since the desert sands had covered over the Canal of the Pharaohs. In that time, Egypt had come to be ruled by many conquerors. Now, in the mid-19th century, the world was ready and eager for a canal to revive the ancient trade routes for the modern era. But the Ottoman Turks who ruled Egypt were not interested. Neither was Muhammad Ali, the former Turkish general, now Viceroy of Egypt. Muhammad Ali needed to be convinced a canal through the Suez would be in her best interest. In 1854, a well-born young Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps set out to do just that. Throughout his rule in the early part of the 19th century, Muhammad Ali had been urged by his European advisors to authorize a canal through the Isthmus of Suez. But the Egyptian leader offered a deaf ear. Ferdinand de Lesseps, a young French diplomat and engineer, was acquainted with Muhammad Ali and his family. De Lesseps had read the account of Napoleon's expeditions in Egypt in 1798 and believed strongly that a canal could and should be built. He also knew that if he wished to remain in the Viceroy's good graces, he would do well not to mention the subject. Instead, the young consul developed a relationship with Prince Mohammed Said, the Viceroy's son. The prince had a weight problem which displeased his father.
Le fils
The son tended to be obese,
avait tendance à l'obésité.
so his father, Muhammad Ali,
Alors,
who was very strict, had to put him on a diet.
d'une sévérité
So he would come over to my grandfather's house in order to have decent meals. Moreover, the viceroy wanted him to learn fencing, horse riding, swimming, all the sports that my grandfather was so good at.
And the rumor is that de Lesseps was the only place where the poor corpulent Said could get a plate of spaghetti. True or not, it makes for a good story. And so a friendship broke out between the two. And when Said became ruler, de Lesseps hurried from France and said, "I will make your name famous in the world." He did.
It was during this reunion with his old friend Said in 1854 that de Lesseps began to make his case for building a canal in the Suez. Mohammed Said needed little persuasion. On November 30th, 1854, he drafted what came to be known as the first concession, giving his